Really thrilled to be joining you all from Australia, from Melbourne, Australia, where it's 6:45 p.m. here and dark outside. But the beginning of this second day of this wonderful conference. I tuned into a little bit yesterday. Won't be able to stay for the whole lot tonight because I'll be going to bed, but I'm thrilled to be here this morning. Thank you for having me. As is our way in Australia, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on stolen land. I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who never ceded sovereignty or connection to this country that we now call the beautiful Mornington Peninsula, where I live. I pay respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present, and I honour the children and young people who carry the wisdom of their ancestors into our shared future, which is the most important thing when we're talking about children and young people. I'm going to share my screen. And I'll be talking today about time, specifically child time and children's right to time and to childhood, and adults' tendency to steal time from children in ways that are inexcusable if we're thinking through a rights lens. I'm going to be using Bronfenbrenner's social ecological lens as a jumping off point. I won't be going into too much detail. I've written about the social ecology of prolific offending in an article that I'm happy to share if you're interested in that model and learning more about it. The main thing I'm going to be engaging with today, speaking to you, is Bronfenbrenner's idea of the importance of the chronosystem, chronos meaning time, and time itself. I'm going to stretch these ideas and hopefully in ways that that Bronfenbrenner would have found interesting and useful. So an brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. I'll start briefly with children's rights to childhood, then I'll speak briefly about Bronfenbrenner's idea of nested ecologies and the chronosystem. I'll touch on the notion of child time as opposed to adult time. I'll introduce the Australian context for you, and then I'll talk about some examples drawn from Indigenous perspectives in Australia. Now I'll focus in on Indigenous perspectives on time and what we might learn from that perspective, and what it means for children's multiple temporalities. And lastly, I'll come to this idea of killing time and what this means for justice. So starting with the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with which everybody I'm sure listening is extremely familiar, we have a very clear, well-articulated set of rights to which children are entitled, that no child shall be subjected to torture or cruel and inhuman treatment or punishment in Article 37, which relates to children's being in conflict with the law. Children being persons explicitly below 18 years of age. We have the right for children who shall be deprived of their liberty only where lawful and only as a last resort, and for the shortest appropriate period of time, which is an interesting concept. Hold that thought, we'll come back to it. The right for every child who is deprived of their liberty to be treated with humanity and respect for their inherent dignity as a person, and in a manner which takes into account the needs of persons of his or her age. So childhood is essentially a temporal concept, different to adulthood by virtue of its being not adult and being in flux and in development, in contrast to an adulthood being no longer child. So just flicking back to that rights slide for a moment. One issue I'd like to point out about a rights perspective is the tendency to invoke a fairly binary, dichotomous black and white perspective of children as different from adults. A binary view of legal, illegal, offending, non-offending, child, adult, as if these things existed in perfect clear opposition to one another, when in fact, when we actually look at the complexity of human lives and human development, we see the category of being not yet adult and being no longer child as always blurring into one another, categories that are inherently unstable. So this is important to think about the complexity of children's lives, not as fixed and stable and complete, but always in flux and always changing, and understanding how young people become criminalised and how they become involved in serious or persistent offending in particular, and how they can best be supported into more positive and fulfilling, flourishing lives, requires a deep, deep understanding and engagement with the complexities of their lives. So Bronfenbrenner's social ecological lens affords such a view that can disrupt that sort of binary perspective, that binary understanding of children as not adults and as either offending or not offending, and start to see into the complexity of children's lives in ways that affords a view of how that complexity unfolds simultaneously in the moment, to refer to a recent paper by Haynes and myself and others in 2021, so in the moment and across time. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bronfenbrenner's social ecological or bioecological framework for understanding how an individual's life is embedded in different nested ecologies and relationships that from the immediate setting of the family and neighbourhood and peers out to the social and cultural setting. And often we see this system represented in images such as the one on the screen, which, forgive the fuzziness, these concentric circles that while having the ability to afford a view of complexity, actually also risk sometimes, depending on how it's used, kind of tending to reduce that complexity to a simplified version. So that's a risk with an ecological lens, that we can use it in too simple a way that simplifies that complexity, that multiplicity in the context of children's lives. Often, as you may be familiar yourselves with when you've come across the social ecological approach or the framework, often the chroma system is not even included or accounted for. Yet time was always, and even before Bronfenbrenner explicitly developed his idea of the chroma system, time was always central to every aspect of his developmental framework for understanding human and children development. For example, in his notion of process, person, context, time. So because of these risks of leaving bits out and of reducing complexity and simplifying children's lives, I think a more useful version of the social ecological lens that includes the chroma system is something like what you see on the screen here, which I borrowed from I found on Twitter from Stern et al., which considers the temporal context of children's lives, the things that happen in their everyday life, but also in terms of the historical period in which they are growing and developing, and how those changes and events affect their life and affect their development over time. And this is the critical context that I want to draw our attention to today in thinking about child time and how it's different to adult time. And you'll see in this lovely representation, we have things like the historical and intergenerational trauma carried by people through generations and through into childhood on the right-hand side, and on the left we see the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which systemic racism also influences the whole system and gives rise to various barriers and events that can shape children's experiences. So I want to focus on child time, this idea of child time that I'm developing with you today. So I think we can agree that child time is different to adult time, and that children and adults experience time differently. So, and youth and childhood compared to adulthood are distinguished by the fact that they are transitional stages of development that are more ephemeral, more fleeting and more fugitive. They don't last as long as adulthood. So I really like this quote from Raoul van Agen's The Revolution of Everyday Life, and I want to come back to it. I'll read it for you now. The child's days escape adult time. Their time is swollen by subjectivity, passion, dreams haunted by reality, Outside, the educators look on, waiting, watch in hand, till the child joins and fits the cycle of hours. It's they who have time. So by they, he's talking about the educators, the adults in the room. So in terms of how children experience time, as I mentioned before, the paper by Kevin Haynes and others, Steve Case, who we'll be hearing from shortly, and myself and other esteemed colleagues, children act in the moment. Yet, and in that paper we elaborate various ways in which this manifests. But I think this notion of acting in the moment is also a really important way of thinking about and locating ourselves in children's experiences of time that challenge adult notions of kind of linear, stable time that is segmented and ordered. In fact, when we understand time through the lens that I'll be expanding upon today, moments penetrate into each other, projecting the past into the future. Children's nostalgia and yearning and remembering exists in the present, in the past, and in the future, imagining and yearning for a future not yet come based on past experiences in their earlier lives. So in this way, time is not linear, it's circular, it's fragmented. In this way, too, child time sits outside, inside, alongside, and outside adult time. Recalling the Ganagum's quote, child's days escape adult time. A beautiful example of this was brought to my attention recently from a dear friend of mine, a 13-year-old who was hauled before the school principal, who said to him, "I've been here a long time," to which he replied, "I've been here my whole life." So I think this is an interesting example of how child time escapes adult time, sits within adult time, but also outside adult time, underneath and alongside. And if we think about that image for a moment of the child in the school principal's office, and we think about what is the meaning of a concept such as desistance, for example, for a child whose whole life fits into a fragment of an adult's career. So already seeing the different ways in which children's child time fits in doesn't fit in adult time, or fits within but also outside. So if we contrast this with adult time, or what you might understand as institutional time, whereas we can understand children's time as multiple and operating at different scales simultaneously. Obviously, one of those scales is institutional time. Yet we need to recognise the limits of adult knowledge about young people's perspectives on the world and their experience of time, how adults always look back, down and through a different temporality. So as adults, although we assume we're inhabiting the same time, the same temporality, in fact, we're looking very differently back on children's experiences. And in many ways, we take time. Time is taken or stolen from children when we impose that way of looking on children's lives and children's time, when we impose adult time. Because we use time, don't we, to regulate, to order, to control children through schools, through timetables, through punishment regimes. We use time to contain and confine, to squash and rein children in. If we think about youth justice intervention, the notion of time out, that can be before youth justice intervenes. Actually, that can be outside the kitchen on a timeout chair, or in a primary school, outside a primary school classroom. But this idea of timeout flows into youth justice intervention and manifests in sentences of detention or remands for custody, the way time is used to punish children and stolen from children, the notion of having a last chance or being taught consequential thinking rather than emphasising creativity, for example, are ways in which adult time is used in these ways to regulate children's lives and children's time. And in fact, we can start to trace, if we think about these many ways in which adult time is imposed on children's lives, we can start to see many forms of harm, some fairly benign and everyday, but others very serious and with long-lasting consequences. For example, the notion of spirit murder that Patricia Williams developed in 1987, and which Bettina Love has written about more recently as in the context of secure schools as causing a slow death, what she describes as a death of the spirit that she attributes to the denial of inclusion, protection, safety, nurturance, and acceptance because of fixed yet fluid and mouldable structures of racism. So she's talking about racialised young people. I would argue that we can apply the notion, the idea she's talking about of spirit murder to equally to non-racialised groups as well. And I'll explore that a little bit as I go along. So I want to introduce you to introduce the Australian context. There's a photograph in the background of a mountain range in central Victoria called, well, it was by the settler colonists called the Grampians, which is nice because I'm speaking to Scotland today. We call it now Garroward in the local language. That's just a little aside. So in Australia, we have 8 states and territories that each have their own youth justice legislation and legislative framework, but across the country, the age of criminal responsibility has until very recently been 10 uniformly, despite very vigorous campaigning to raise the age to 14. One of our territories, the ACT, and one of our states has very recently announced that they'll be raising the age to 12. We had a Royal Commission in 2016 in the Northern Territory suggesting that, recommending that the age of criminal responsibility be raised to 12. Yet this age of 10 persists across most of the country. We have in 2020 to 2021, we had approximately on an average day, just under 5,000 children engaged with youth justice in Australia, and 96% of these were over 14. So only a small proportion under, age 10, 11, 12 and 13, but still a significant number in some communities especially. About 1 in 6 of those children were in detention, so most of them are supervised in the community. Startlingly, nearly 3/4 of all young people in detention are not sentenced. And there's one statistic that I would like to share with you to sort of give you a taste of what we're looking at in the Australian context, that just over half, 51% of young people in unsentenced detention, aged 10 and over on an average day during that period, 2020 to 2021, identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander children. And that was in Victoria, just under 9% of children on remand in unsentenced detention, compared to in the Northern Territory, 95% of children. So the important context to understand here, to put these figures into context, is that approximately 5 or 6% of all children aged 10 to 17 in Australia identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, yet this huge, overwhelming proportion of children involved in the youth justice system identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So this context of over-criminalisation, over-policing, over-imprisonment that we almost glibly describe as over-representation is part of the reason that I want to explore today with you some ideas of Indigenous, an Indigenous example of an Indigenous young person's experience, but also to think about what we can learn from Indigenous perspectives of time and how that connects to country. Because I think we can all learn from Indigenous perspectives. So they're not, the examples I'm going to introduce to you are not just relating to Indigenous young people. I think they can help us understand the experiences of all young people involved with the justice system or experiencing over-criminalisation. 1 in 3 young people involved with youth justice, just as Fiona mentioned in the earlier remarks, in Scotland, 1 in 3 in Australia also come from the poorest communities, the least resourced areas in the country. And 46% of all those nearly 5,000 children supervised had been in detention during that year. So a high turnover of children in and out of detention, even if it's only for a short time. So I want to share with you a clip from a film now, and hopefully I will just check, no, share sound, optimize clip. This is a film called In My Blood It Runs that was made and released in 2019. It's available online. I urge you to watch it. It's about a young man called Duan Hussein, who is an Anja and Goaman young man. He turns 10 in the film, so he's actually 9-year-old for most of the film. He's recognised as a special little boy in his community, and he's recognised as a healer. He speaks 3 languages. He's a bright and clever little boy, but as we see in the film, and as you'll understand if you watch all of the film at some point, he's made to feel a failure because of the way the education system is structured around white values and norms. I'm just going to play the trailer now, so hopefully, yeah.
How many kids do you have?
3.
Which one do you love?
The whole 3, you say?
It's really important to look after your family members. Bush medicine heals up your body. Sometimes it goes to our hands.
One is the one that I worry about the most. He's got his own mind. Come on in. Come on.
It's about the history of our country. He claimed for the English country the whole of this new land.
What happened at school?
The history that we told at school, that was for white people.
They don't know their culture. They don't teach them their culture.
Duan ran away from school today at about 1:30.
Do you want to get locked up with those other kids? This is your last chance.
They're not going to take my grandchildren away from me. We want our kids to grow up learning things both ways.
The first one that had the magic was the first people that had the land.
We want our language. We want our stories told to our children.
Don't know what's going to happen after that.
What I want is a normal life of just being me. I just felt something, a memory.
Apologies, my video was off. So, reflecting on that film, I think what stands out is a child living outside adult time, but particularly a child living outside settler colonial time. And for Duan, being connected to his culture, as for all Indigenous children, gives him strength, gives him identity, and gives him a sense of capacity that the settler colonial constraints do not give him. So I want to explore some Indigenous perspectives on time to put Duan's experience into context. One of those constraints, of course, that I meant to mention was the fact that he had, turning 10, he had the threat of criminalisation hanging over his head for the fairly minor little things that he was doing to get in trouble, such as running away from school. Stealing a bicycle one night was one thing that shows up in the film. So now I want to talk about some Indigenous perspectives on time to put into context this idea of child time and how it challenges Western Eurocentric notions of time that dominate, and also give us insight into the way in which child time actually evokes a universal sense of multiple time frames and temporalities that can be useful for understanding how children experience the world. For the Yolngu of Northeast Arnhem in Australia, as for other Indigenous peoples, time is spiral. It's non-linear, it's affective, it's plural. So past, present and future are not static singular states that exist in a linear sense in terms of the sort of the arrow of time. Rather, they are circular, they're multiple and they are collective, they exist together. And from this perspective, a person does not simply exist as a lone individual acting in a single time. Our time, our existence, our lives are constantly and simultaneously unfolding within multiple temporalities, from the individual moment-to-moment time to geologic time. So from this perspective, we might consider, as Yin Paradis, an Indigenous political activist and academic in Australia, we might consider the past, present and future as nested and folded together. So again, this is very beautifully fitting with the Bronfenbrenner's social ecological notion of nested ecologies unfolding within a temporal context. So these nested and folded together, encircling linear, goal-centred, dissected clock time, our Eurocentric kind of linear sense of adult time, through rhythmic, cyclical, spiral sensing. So we have this sense of a bigger, multiple sense of time, a cyclic, rhythmic time where the future can be remembered, the past is yet to come, and now is experienced as spatial, slushy, textured, every when. And by every when, he's talking about multiple times occurring at different, many times all at once. Again, that was in Paradis. So human perception cannot even start to comprehend many of the complex temporalities at work here. This is from a paper the first author is Balaka Country with other human authors, and then in this paper we learn of the seasonal time of clouds gathering. It is also the time of hydrological cycles of water moving through aquifers for thousands of years, of transpiration and growth, and short spirals of the flash of lightning, claps of thunder, of travelling sound and light. There is neither a single weather, nor a single time, nor an inherent difference between time and matter and embodied experience. This is a very different understanding of time and challenges our adult notion of institutional, ordered, segmented time. But it does give us insight into the multiple temporalities of childhood and the way in which childhood is shaped and experienced as multiple temporalities. If we think of children's learning through moments of discovery, how there is no temporal, the temporality of those moments is entirely outside children's time. Anyone who has a toddler completely understands this, trying to get a toddler off a swing or out of a puddle, for example. If we think of how children play, this is another temporality outside the adult's time. Children learning to trust in the moment and over time. Children learning their strengths, learning their power, developing skills and capabilities. These also happen at different temporalities. So children carrying the trauma, their own, of their experiences of violence or neglect or fear or uncertainty, but also inheriting the trauma of their parents and families and generations before them. I like to think of the different temporalities that exist within which our lives unfold through the land. I think of an example of the waves lapping at the shoreline and the way in which the rhythm of the tide has a regular, lovely in and out that sounds a bit like our own breathing. It's very in the moment. Yet, if we think about the ocean being pulled by the moon and the temporality of the tides, and that's sort of a larger scale, the sort of 8-hourly movement of the waves. And then if we think about the time it takes for the waves to grind stone and shorelines into sand, then that is beyond our comprehension. That's another temporality existing at the same time. So this is how I like to think about all these multiple temporalities occurring within which we are encircled and entwined and unfolding all the time simultaneously. Of course, joy is a momentary thing, a momentary temporality that we live by too, because it's part of our human search for meaning and happiness. And there's Duan celebrating his 10th birthday. So this idea of killing time, if we think about Duan's experience of school, of his knowledge and history and cultural identity being kind of invisibilized in school. It's an example perhaps of the spirit murdering that Williams and Love mentioned before. We can think about other forms of killing time when we think about children remanded to custody for uncertain periods or sentenced to custody for certain periods. These are all the different ways in which children's lives and children's time is stolen by adults. If we think about these different temporalities existing beyond adult time. So what does this mean for justice? If we think about the UNCRC opens with these words in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations has proclaimed that childhood is entitled to special care and assistance. But if we accept that as adults, we steal time, we kill children's time by forcing them into these, imposing adult constraints, temporal constraints, and related constraints on them. We can think of that as siphoning off life, siphoning off spiritual, emotional, developmental, cultural life from children in ways that are actually unjustifiable from a rights perspective, which supposedly values children's voices and experiences and their inherent dignity. So from a human perspective, this is, regardless of human rights, from a human futurity perspective, this is unsustainable. If we think about Gonton, Brennan and Morris's final words to their 2007 article, no society can long sustain itself unless its members have learned the sensitivities, motivations and skills involved in assisting and caring for other human beings. And we can only learn this through other human beings. So this draws our attention to the fact that justice demands care and caring through relationships of trust and mutual respect that are stable and secure and predictable through time, over time, unfolding within these multiple temporalities that we share. Yesterday, we heard from the wonderful young board members of Our Hearing's Our Voice. And I was so struck by the materials they shared. I have popped this into my slides. I really liked this part of their imagery. They mentioned some of these ways in which children are harmed by adult imposition of temporal constraints, by adult time being forced over children's lives. And some of the things they mentioned were get rid of chronologies. They are traumatising. Social workers must spend time with me to explain the things they write in my reports. They talked about being always able to spend time with my family when I'm able and allowed to do so, just as Duan emphasised in that little clip we saw. And make it quicker to be in permanency. This is an example of how adult time delays and stalls and creates pockets of uncertain time that make childhood difficult and in those ways steal childhood, steal the security and care for which children are entitled. So we adults have time. We have more time than children. It's up to us to spend time with children, listening to children. And in the words of Duan Hussein, when he addressed the UN in 2019, in September 2019 in Geneva, when he spoke as a 12-year-old to the Human Rights Council, stop fooling our kids. There he is there. So thank you for listening. I've left some time for questions, and I welcome those now. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was a really thought-provoking presentation there. And I think something especially for us in Scotland, we use the term over-representation a lot. Our care experienced children are over-represented. And I'm going to start saying that now, they're over-criminalised. I think that's important to change that, the way we frame that. But I think, again, in relation to time, it is something we've been considering a lot. We're looking at children who are remanded to custody for 12 months at the moment due to the pandemic in some cases, and really saying for that time for them compared to an adult is just massive, and how we need to have different guidance for children, and really looking at that to really think about the time there. So I think it's really important. So thank you for highlighting that. I think it's definitely given me, and I'm sure others, a lot to think about. So I don't know if there's any questions come through. If anyone has, we've got a few minutes for questions. I think there's some coming here. Plenty of people again saying plenty of reflection. Here's one. Do you believe that the social construction of time and of childhood itself leads to increased punitive approaches? And what would a new approach to justice look like? So just a small question there.
Little question. I think we need to avoid criminalising children. You know, I was talking to a group of children the other day, and when I said this, that no child under 18 should ever be criminalised, they said, what would we do with them? This is a group of children, teenagers. So I explained the possibilities of relational practices and restorative practices and all the other ways in which we can hold children, the ways we can contain, harmful behaviour, the ways we can hold people accountable for harming others, and the way we can still care for children while doing those things. So I think there are all sorts of possibilities for rethinking justice for children and thinking past criminalisation. So yes, I definitely think the social construction of childhood and time, kind of always speaking back to each other and confusing us, if it's socially constructed, that's a good thing because we're constructing children as different from adults, but then the social construction of time, what does that mean? So I think it's the point of thinking with these ideas, and the point of thinking for me through a social ecological lens and through a chronosystemic lens is to work with complexity and not have to have things all one way or all the other. It's not either or, it's always and. So I think that's the part of the way we need to think about working with children. Yes, we're constructing childhood is up to the age of 18. Maybe it should be up to 24, depending on 28, who knows? Maybe it should depend on the child. But I think it's complexity and multiplicity that we need to constantly struggle with. Thank you for that question.
And another question here, has your work been able to influence the time that children spend on remand, like my example there before trial, because currently timescales in Scotland are lengthy and we still have mandatory life sentence? Has your work been able to influence that? Is there something we can learn in Scotland?
I'd like to think so. I don't think so. I think the issue with remand, we think it has so many layers. There's the legislative framework, there's the political drive, the political impetus to shape those legislative frameworks. There's the way in which the law is interpreted by magistrates and by police, and there's the regional and cultural differences in different places and different areas that influence those decisions. So it's never just a straightforward, we do this and this happens. It's always about working locally, with building relationships with people, slowly influencing people by sharing ideas and stretching, our thinking and challenging the way we do things and challenging orthodoxy. So I do try and do that all the time. Whether I'm successful, we'll see.
There's lots in the chat. I think we've been trying to share some of your links in our Padlet, Diana, but there's maybe one we maybe don't have access to, so I'll let you have a look through the chat. I think if there is, or unless there is any other questions, it's sort of trying to keep abreast of both here, but I think if I give you a chance to maybe look through the chat and see, I think people are saying how fascinating it is, really food for thought, ethically, things to think about there. and how, yeah, and about for us all to learn from, about listening to children rather, you know, listening to hear rather than listening to speak. I think that's really important. Just maybe one final question, Diana, before I let you go. What do you think about the relationship between multiple time and restorative justice?
That's an interesting one. So I think back to a very sharp memory I have of witnessing a restorative process that had occurred a long time after a young person who at the time was young, 13 or 14, had seriously violently assaulted an older young man who was in his early 20s. And the time that had elapsed since that offence and the time that the young man who'd been assaulted had struggled and just been broken by that experience, by the terror and fear that he'd lived with since it had happened, and also the time that the young man who'd committed the offence had been able to confront some of the anger that he was dealing with having his parents unable to care for him and unable to care for themselves, and all those different things that were going on, and how that conference, that restorative conversation that took place over 2 or 2.5, maybe 3 hours, involved a lot of people sharing a lot of emotion, was able to bring those temporalities into conversation and into the same space. So I think, unlike scheduled kind of court hearings that don't allow those things, I think a restorative process can occur, and of course the lead up to a restorative process where people are prepared for the conference and really prepared for meeting with the person who's caused them so much terror often, that's part of that temporality, part of that process. I think that kind of restorative work holds multiple temporalities so well and so powerfully and so potently, in that we can really as humans engaging in those processes, we can come out transformed. So I think there's incredible power in those kind of conversations, in those kind of meetings and encounters. Yeah.
Definitely. And just, I think, a final question, just I think going back to sentencing, we've had to hear about, you know, a sentence length of time for say a 12-year-old, the life sentence compared to an adult for that. So the question is here, have you thought about how we make things quantifiable in relation to sentencing? I'm
a qualitative researcher. So I think back to my point that, you know, I think in my ideal world, we wouldn't sentence children. But perhaps there's a role for thinking about how restorative practice works in schools when it works well, and, you know, peers judging peers, although often children can be even heavier than adults. That can be something that I think could be useful in involving children in their own outcomes. We do that as parents with our children increasingly. We do it in classrooms. I think that's a possibility, involving young people and their peers in those decisions about, you know, how long is long enough? What's appropriate?
Yeah, a jury of your peers, indeed.
Yes.
Well, Diana, thank you so much for coming today or this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Really,
and I'll share the in the moment article that somebody asked me. I'll share the link in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And again, we will add that to the Padlet so people can have that. So Diana Jones, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Hannah, I'm now going to hand over to you to introduce our next speaker. Thanks.